This is the Disaster Recovery Pro. Welcome back to our video series where we discuss important concepts in disaster recovery and business continuity. In today's video, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to put on our business continuity hat, and we're going to do a little case study on something that's going on in the world today in the comic book industry. Basically, the pandemic of early 2020 has had a strong impact on the comic book industry's business model in primarily a people and process manner. And if you've watched some of my previous videos, you know that that's one of the things that distinguishes business continuity from disaster recovery, in that business continuity is primarily a people and process problem rather than a technology problem. So this is a good example to take a look at just to understand that concept a little better. So let's take a brief look at how the industry works and what the disruption has been. While the comic book publishers do make money off their intellectual property rights and merchandising and that sort of thing, their bread and butter is made by creating and selling comic books. Comics are sold in both physical and digital or ebook format, but physical sales account for something like 90% of the market. Collectors of comic books, they're collectors. They want the physical book. And digital sales are there, but they've never been a huge factor in the comic book industry. Another thing of note about the industry is that the three major roles, that's the publisher, the distributor, and the retail stores, they're all distinct independent businesses. There's lots of little stores. They're all independent companies of their own. The distributors are independent companies, and the publishers are all their own companies. So it's not like one overarching company is controlling the entire vertical here. You have a lot of different independent participants in this overall product pipeline, and they don't all directly deal with each other. So the 2020 pandemic has had an effect on all three of these roles within the industry pipeline in different ways. So the social distancing lockdowns that were enacted to combat the pandemic have directly affected the stores. They're not able to connect with their customers very easily anymore. They have to resort to either mail order or curbside service if they can even operate at all. So their revenue has been heavily impacted. With revenue down, the stores can't pay the distributor anymore. They're not going to be ordering new product if they can't sell it, so that affects the distributor as well. This put the distributors in a position where they can't order more product from the publishers, so the publishers aren't making money either, and they're doing massive layoffs and stoppages of production as well. Now, the stores are still able to do some minimal level of business. The publishers can still operate and do their intellectual property deals and things like that, but the distributors are basically shut down. All three of these major industry roles, they depend on product being moved on a regular basis. Every week there's a new set of new comics coming out, so they all depend on these moving on a constant basis to fund the next round of production. Most of the players involved don't have particularly deep pockets or cash reserves. This means that they're surviving from one business cycle to the next, using funds from one business cycle to fund the next business cycle's operations. So when this gets disrupted, this has a really drastic effect on their ability to do business. Some of the larger publishers, they have a little bit of a safety net because they're backed by large parent companies that do have deep pockets and may be able to bankroll them through the disruption. Those parent companies are also having their own problems during this time, so that's a little uncertain. Currently, we're in the middle of all this, so we don't know exactly where it's going to go, but it's not looking very good for the comic book industry with their distribution network effectively shut down. So let's start breaking all this down by charting out the whole process in a swim lane diagram. So here we've got three swim lanes, one for each of the roles within the industry. The top is the publisher, in the middle is the distributor, and the bottom is the retail store. This chart shows you the flow of a single business cycle, starting with the publisher, getting all the way down to the final comic book sale. It shows how the responsibility of the ball gets passed between these three parties back and forth through the course of one business cycle. So we start at the top left where the comic book publisher, they create their batch of comics that they're going to put out in this business cycle, and they pass that information on to the distributor who puts it in their catalog for this week or this business cycle. That catalog then gets passed on to the stores, who then place their orders for this business cycle. I want 100 of this book, 5,000 of this book, whatever the numbers are. The distributor collects all of these orders from all of the stores that they work with, combines them together, and sends a print order back up to the publisher, who then prints on demand however many books they need of each type to fill these orders. The publisher then sends these printed comic books to the distributor. The distributor divides them up into shipments to the individual stores, sends them off to the stores, and then the stores can actually stock those comics and sell them to the customers directly. In our next diagram, we take a little look at how the money and product flows through the system and add a little bit more information about the composition of the industry. Our first box represents the publishers, and as you can see, we've got several different publishing companies in there. I haven't put in names or anything like that, but I wanted to represent that there are many different independent publishers of various sizes, and that the industry is mostly dominated by two large publishers and a whole slew of smaller publishers. Towards the bottom of the chart, we've got a representation of our stores. Now, there are thousands of comic book stores across the country, so instead of drawing thousands of individual circles, I've represented the stores by a representative group of, say, 6 stores. It should be understood that in reality, this is representing a list of thousands of stores. Now, if we look at the block where I represent the distributors, well, this is a fairly accurate representation of the industry. There is one large distributor that services almost the entire comic book industry. There's maybe 1 or 2 small publishers that distribute on their own or through other channels, but almost every single publishing company works through one distributor. We can see very clearly in the chart that product flows from the publishers down through the distributor, down to the stores, and then to the customers, and money flows up from the customers to the stores, to the distributor, and finally to the publishing company. This diagram should pretty clearly show you where the business continuity weakness is in this chain. When the pandemic of 2020 hit, it was really the stores that were affected most directly. It restricted their ability to do business. They can't make much money because of restrictions on having lots of people in the store and that they're non-essential businesses and shouldn't be operating. So their only ways of making money was through ancillary things like curbside pickup for the ones that are still allowed to do that, and some limited online sales. Their cash flow is restricted to the point where there's probably a good number of stores that are not going to survive the pandemic. These are small sole proprietor or mom and pop type stores that don't have very deep pockets. They're living almost week to week or month to month. So restricting their revenue like this is a big problem for them. But that problem cascades further up the line, as we'll see in a second. In our next chart, we see how the restriction of cash flow at the bottom of the chain had bigger consequences for entities further up the chain. The financial stress on the stores left them in a place where they weren't able to place orders for new product, and they could no longer keep up with payments to their distributor. The distributor, in turn, now doesn't have the cash flow to pay the publishers to print books, and the stores aren't even ordering new books while they're in financial straits either, since they're not likely to be able to move that product to customers, at least not at the capacity that they're used to. The real problem comes in because there's only one distributor servicing the entire publishing industry. As it turns out, this distributor did not have deep pockets or large cash reserves, so a few weeks, or at this point potentially a few months, of downtime is devastating to them. They've effectively had to shut down operations, at least temporarily, and lay off staff in an attempt to stay alive until the crisis is over. At this point, where we're only 2 or 3 weeks into the crisis, it's really uncertain if this distributor is going to survive at all. It's also uncertain if all the stores are going to survive. Certainly some of them are going to go under in this time period. There are enough of them, however, that it's likely at least some of them will survive, or at least a large enough portion of them will survive to still have a viable business once we come out the other side of the crisis. In turn, this has cut off the publishers from one of their largest revenue streams. In order to survive, their only options are to either scramble and try and find another distributor, or lean into their digital sales, which have always been lean historically. So it's going to be a huge challenge for them to even attempt to convert their physical customers into digital customers, especially when you consider that the publishing companies don't really have a direct connection to the customers without the distributor and the store in the chain. It's pretty clear to see that we saw a failure to follow some best practices in business continuity, and it seems that the industry as a whole was either unaware of these best practices or unable to implement them, and eventually things caught up to them. Even though this is an ongoing situation, only 3 weeks in, we can already see what some of the best practices and recommendations are pretty clearly. You need to be aware of single points of failure in your supply chain and your distribution chain, especially when you're relying on third parties for these things. That's your upstream and downstream, where you're getting the things you need to do your job and where you're sending things in order to make money. Any point where one failure can disrupt the entire chain needs to be addressed. You also need to be aware of how impacts can cascade up or down the supply chain or distribution chain from parties you don't deal with directly. In this case, the publishing companies got impacted by something that affected the stores. That impact cascaded up through their distributor and disrupted the entire system. You need to be aware of how that can happen, even though you may not have a direct relationship with the part of the supply chain that's going to cause the problem. You also need to know the financial health of all your third-party business partners and make reporting that financial health part of your partnership agreements, your contracts, your service level agreements with them. Again, you may be able to get away with a single point of failure if you know that that single point of failure is very robust and has its own checks and balances to deal with business continuity impacts. You should also make sure that you know how much and what types of downtime or disruptions your business partners can withstand before they have problems that could come back to bite you. A really important one is to make sure that you require all your third-party business partners share their continuity and contingency plans with you, and that you do the same with them. You should really do this as part of your vetting process so that you know who you're getting in business with and what their risks are before you enter into a business relationship with them. You should make requirements around business continuity and preparedness part of your contracts and service level agreements with your third-party partners. Don't get into business with them unless they're aware that they have a responsibility to show that they've got some sort of protection. And probably the biggest one is make sure that you have diverse business partners. That's your best practice. Always have more than one supplier, always have more than one distributor. In cases where you're forced to work with a single party, make sure that they've got a really robust risk management and business continuity plan in place. A business relationship like this is like a marriage. When you marry them, you're also marrying their families and their problems and inheriting their risks as well. And you can see in our comic book industry example, the biggest problem was the lack of diversity of distributors. That single point of failure was a big problem. The other big problem there is that the single point of failure did not have a good business continuity plan in place, and they were not very robust business. It really did not take all that much to shut down the entire industry and put the entire industry at risk, and in a place where we're not really sure what the industry is going to look like when it comes out of the other side of the crisis. If we go back to our comparison of business continuity versus disaster recovery, yes, this was a disastrous event, but it's a business continuity event. It did not involve a technological solution or a technological problem. This was purely a business problem, an interruption in supply chain, logistics, and cash flow. That's exactly the thing that business continuity needs to be aware of. If you are a disaster recovery practitioner, maybe that's not your primary focus, but you do need to be aware of the business implications and business risks, as well as the technological ones. So thanks for watching today's presentation. If you found this topic interesting and you want to learn more about disaster recovery and business continuity, please go ahead and like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with everybody else. Like we always say here at the Disaster Recovery Pro, hope for the best, but plan for the worst, and have a great day.